I'm Jim Blanton, the director of the Louisville Free Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. We have a fantastic author with us this evening. As many of you know, tonight's program is part of the Craig Buteau Author Series. This endowed series honoring former library director Craig Buteau brings award-winning and New York Times best-selling authors to LFPL. Our next author in this series is best-selling biographer Brian J. Jones, and he'll be here on December 13th, and I'm particularly excited about this one being a sci-fi nerd because his latest book explores the creative genius of Star Wars and Indiana Jones creator George Lucas. Programs like the Craig Buteau Author Series, Summer Reading, and the How-To Festival are made possible through the support of donors to the Library Foundation, and on behalf of the Foundation, they've asked me to share some exciting news with you this evening. The Foundation is currently in the middle of their fall fundraising campaign, and an anonymous donor has offered the Foundation $10,000 as a matching gift challenge to encourage new and increased donations in support of the Louisville Free Public Library. With that in mind, if you'd like to make a gift, it will go twice as far now. You can grab a brochure at the table in the back in the lobby and mail your gift in, or you can do it online as well. The Foundation thanks you for making our library the best that it can be. Tonight's speaker is a prolific and award-winning author. He blogs actively about media and politics and has produced several acclaimed film documentaries. He has also won numerous awards as the editor and publisher. His book tonight, The Tunnels, Escapes Under the Berlin Wall, and the historic films The JFK White House Tried to Kill, chronicles two harrowing attempts to rescue East Germans via tunnels below the Berlin Wall in 1962. The author has drawn on a trove of recently declassified documents from the Stasi archives, the JFK Library, personal papers, and dozens of interviews with many of the key players to offer this new reckoning with the haunting legacy of the Berlin Wall. Please join me in welcoming Greg Mitchell.
Okay, well, welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight. I know that some of you probably want to get home to watch the World Series, so we'll try to move this along as best we can. This is my first visit to Louisville, believe it or not, and I've just only been here a little over 24 hours. I really love the city. Seems like a really great city. I don't really have a little Louisville anecdote. I do have one small thing, was that I was a Muhammad Ali fan from my youth. I remember literally reading the first Sports Illustrated article about him, 1960 or 61, which focused on the Louisville or the Kentucky syndicate behind him. And I'm actually one of the few people who can probably say I was his editor. It's in the mid-1970s I edited for a magazine, and we published two separate pieces that he wrote. Probably he dictated them, I'm not sure, but they came in written, and one of them actually became quite famous because he talked about the first girl he ever kissed. And the girl was in a housing project here. It's named Aretha Swint, and she later was sort of confirmed her story. The story was that he kissed her, he'd never kissed a girl, and then he fainted. And she thought he was acting as Ali would, even though he was 14 or 12 or something like that. But in reality, she claimed he actually fainted, and he said the same thing. So it's possible that's confirmed in Ali biographies. It's also possible it's been debunked, but anyway, I edited it and published it. The only other connection I have here, I would say, is I know you have a Louisville Slugger. I went past the Ali Museum today. I know you also have a Louisville Slugger factory and museum. And I did write a book. One of my many books is called Joy in Mudville, and it's about coaching my son in Little League. Been a lifelong baseball fan. And in fact, I was at the Mets-Giants wild card game a couple weeks ago. Sad ending to that game. And one of my very best friends is now the mayor of Cooperstown, believe it or not. But to turn to slightly more serious matters here, and I will get to that. I don't really believe in book readings. I do, as you'll see, I will read a page or two from the book later, but I always just talk about the book. And we're also going to show a brief clip at the end of, near the end of the talk. So, but they say you should always start a talk with a kind of a joke of some kind. It may seem impossible in this case with the subject, but actually there in my book I quote some, what you might call East German Iron Curtain dark humor from the early 1960s. Anyway, one of them, for example, it's very black humor, is, did you know that Adam and Eve were actually East Germans? They had no clothes, they had to share an apple, and they were led to believe that they lived in a paradise. So that gives you the flavor of their humor. There's another joke about how they, apples were so scarce that, and when you got them, they usually had worms, and the shopkeepers charged you more if they had the worms, because that was a little extra bonus. Anyway, so let me open by talking a little bit about how the book happened. It really was dumb luck. My daughter, who was getting her PhD in London and then France, moved to Berlin 3 years ago with her husband and a 3-year-old son. And my wife and I had never been to Berlin, so we rushed to meet them. And on the very last day we were there, we had tried to have a sort of a close encounter with the wall experience, the wall history. I've written many other books, mainly 20th century history things, including 2 books on Hiroshima, so I'm not really afraid of grim subjects. But it's very hard in Berlin now. There's very few remnants of the wall left. There's no major wall museum. So we were kind of frustrated, but the last day dawned, and it was a nice sunny day, and we realized we were only about a mile walk from what's the leading memorial site there. And so we said, well, let's take a nice walk up there. And when we got there, we found this to be one of really the most moving and tasteful and 3, 4, 5 block long experience of what the wall was like there, including the old death strip, guard tower, and very not Disney-fied. And we were exposed, like most Americans, we had very little exposure to escapes at the wall, certainly nothing about tunnels. Even though I grew up very much, unfortunately I'm old enough to remember when Berlin was in the news every day. It was really the hot spot of all the hot spots. So it's not that I didn't really experience Berlin at a distance growing up, but this was the first deep exposure to escapes and things like that. So we came back to and immediately being a writer between books, I was, well, geez, I'd love to do a book on this, but the wall was there from 61 to 89. There were thousands of escapes, and plus these tunnels, and how could I focus this for a book? And besides, would any American publisher be interested? So lo and behold, when I came back to the U.S., I started poking around online and found that there was this story of these 2 TV networks who had filmed or tried to film under the wall, a tunnel under the wall. And one of the programs ended up airing, the other one didn't, and lo and behold, the Kennedy White House seemed to have been involved in trying to suppress these 2 films. So suddenly I had an American angle, beloved president, 2 media companies, and so I really jumped in to research it. I narrowed it down. I found these 2 tunnels both happened in 1 year, within a few weeks in 1962, which narrowed the time frame. And I realized I could do a book strictly about the tunnels, strictly in this 1 year, and with a very strong American angle. So I didn't really have that strong of a background, although I have to say that my favorite movie of the past decade was the Lives of Others. How many of you have seen it? It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film about 8 years ago. And it sort of focuses on a Stasi secret police agent who does sort of one good deed. And so it ended up a Stasi informer plays a key central role in my book. So now I had one problem as I started researching, which you may understand is not a small problem, was that I didn't speak a word of German, except for maybe Ich bin ein Berliner, which is 3 words. But so I knew it was going to be a problem with interviews and documents. But again, dumb luck. My daughter had married a man in London. They moved to his native France and then to Berlin, and he is half German. so he's fluent, obviously, in German, and so he was able to accompany me on all my interviews there. He also translated thousands, or at least hundreds of pages of Stasi documents, of chapters from books that in German, because almost nothing's been written about this in English. So suddenly the access I had was quite extraordinary because of him. I'm not sure how I could have done this book. I guess I could have, paid other people. I actually did have someone in Los Angeles also helping me with the documents, played a key role. But so again, it was kind of luck. Also kind of lucky that it turned out that almost all the key participants in the story, the diggers and the couriers and the escapees, the key people I wanted to talk to, almost all of them were still alive, and they were still living in or near Berlin. So I guess it shows how hardy the German people are or something, but it also reveals to you, if you don't know, that almost all these people were very young people. This is really a book about young people, students, early 20s, mid-20s, who took these bold actions. So, fortunately, these people are 75 or 80 or whatever. They're still alive and able to be interviewed as I did. Another key thing was that the U.S. had recently declassified key State Department documents related to these suppression of what I call the CBS Tunnel and the NBC Tunnel. So there are documents just from the last couple of years that have come out, cables, State Department cables, with some of them written by Dean Rusk, Secretary of State. So there was new material, plus I got thousands of pages of documents from the John F. Kennedy Library and Library of Congress, National Archives, and so forth. So, and as I mentioned, it's very difficult to do, but I got at least 1,000 pages of documents from the Stasi archives in Berlin, which is a very difficult process. So the book is overwhelmingly based on new interviews, on documents, some of them never released before. So it's really, it's historically based. It's not fictionalized in any way. It's not one of these things where, an author kind of has a good story and gets an idea and then they kind of run with it, almost using fictional techniques to tell a story. And I think that kind of story is there. People have compared it to a spy thriller and John le Carré and all this. It certainly has those elements to it, but it's all based on original research. So I've told you a little bit about how the book came to be, so let me pivot to the actual content, which you may be interested in. Starting at the very beginning, of course, Germany was divided after World War II, and the Soviets dominated the eastern part, and the U.S., French, and English, British, were in charge of 3 sectors in West Germany, and the same thing in Berlin. Berlin, as you know, is not on that border. Berlin is deep inside East Germany, so it is surrounded by East Germany, even though Berlin is divided, or was divided itself. So extremely unique and scary situation. So in August 1961, the wall went up almost overnight. The U.S. CIA, as I show in the book, knew nothing about it. Our crack CIA team knew nothing about it. Went up almost overnight, and it was driven largely by, it's partly ideological, of course, but also there had been an incredible flight of refugees from the East, brain drain, and the communists had finally had enough, couldn't handle it anymore, and so they put up a wall, which stopped everything. Until then, there were, believe it or not, 60,000 people a day commuted from East Berlin to West Berlin, students and people commuting to their jobs. So there were controls at the border, but people with passes were allowed to pass, and that ended overnight in August of 1961. Naturally, escape attempts began almost immediately. People were tried to climb the wall, smash through it in trucks, swim canals, use fake IDs. Many were shot in the process. And the East Germans then caught on to most of these things and cracked down. So by early 1962, when my story starts, tunnels had come into vogue. Probably the riskiest, most insane method yet. Dig under the Berlin Wall and then under the Death Strip, which is generally about 2 blocks long, with its police and military and Stasi and guard dogs and barbed wire and guard towers and snipers and military who might drop a grenade down a hole into a tunnel, and then past the tunnel, or past the Death Strip to maybe the basement of a tenement, another couple blocks away. Now, from my description, maybe you've caught on that probably the most mind-boggling detail in all this is that, unlike almost every case in history, and certainly Hollywood movies from The Great Escape to Shawshank Redemption, this was not a case of people digging from imprisonment to freedom, but quite the opposite. It was people digging from freedom to whatever you want to call it, slavery or whatever you think of East Berlin at that time. So these were young, maybe young, crazy men. They were all men who decided to risk their lives to bring out friends, lovers, strangers, family members, spouses, children, by doing this incredible task of digging from west to east. So that's a key thing, and also, of course, made potentially, as we'll see, coverage by the news media possible because they started in the west, so you could go with them in their tunnel towards the east. So, and as it happened, the 2 major networks at that time, NBC and CBS, ABC was still an upstart then, pretty much. NBC and CBS were in an incredible ratings war, and they raced to be first to film a tunnel project and hopefully an escape, hoping for a big primetime TV special. And so it happened, NBC got there first, a correspondent who you'll meet in a little while, Pierce Anderton, one of their leading correspondents, was tipped off to a tunnel. This was a tunnel being dug next to Bernauer Strasse, which is the street my wife and I visited on that fateful day. Where if it had rained, my whole life would be different now. And they were digging a 400 to 450 foot tunnel under the wall, under the Death Strip, to a basement of a tenement. So he was tipped off to this, and he paid for the rights, paid many thousands of dollars for the rights to film. And then ethics questions come into play. Of course, this funding, which was paid out front, went to help build the tunnel. So NBC was subsidizing the building of this project, for several weeks or months. But they started filming in that tunnel, and were headed for that big scoop if it came to fruition, when CBS correspondent Daniel Schorr, who many of you remember as a top CBS newsman and later NPR commentator. He was made proudly Nixon's enemies list a few years later, but in this project he actually made Kennedy's enemies list, you might say. He got a scoop about a shorter tunnel on August 1st of 1962, and he also paid for the rights to film that tunnel and was ready to get his big scoop, one of the big stories of his career. But alas, the U.S. State Department found out about it, and as the book shows in close detail, partly because of these declassified documents, how they tried for several days to bully Schorr, personally meet with him in Bonn or Berlin, bully him into dropping the project. And when that failed, as I will read a bit here, they went to his boss in New York and bullied him into being called to Secretary of State Rusk's office twice to be intimidated by the Secretary of State into canceling the CBS film. Now I'm going to pause here for a second because you may already be asking, well, why was the U.S. so against this coverage? And it's a complex question. I'll take some water here. It's a complex question that I think people will read in the book, all sides to it, and make up your own mind on how you feel about it. Because it was, as I and many of you might remember, a very scary time in the world. Nuclear threat was over all of us. Certainly Berlin was the most likely place to set something off, and any confrontation with the Soviets was always a risk. And so Kennedy and his people, actually, when the wall went up, even though he's known for being ein Berliner, when the wall went up, the U.S. did nothing. In fact, some people, including Kennedy himself, I think, felt that there was a good side to this for sure. Many insiders actually almost welcomed the wall going up because it's signaled that the Soviets were not interested in taking West Berlin. They were going to solidify their hold on East Berlin. And the tensions over this refugee flow were over, and there was going to be a lessening of tension. Now, as it turned out, of course, with people trying to escape, there were many spectacular incidents. Shots fired. The U.S. and the Soviets often fired into each other's zone without really firing at each other. And any day might have brought a shooting incident involving the U.S. and the Soviets. So the U.S. was not crazy about these escape attempts. And of course, they were less thrilled about media coverage of them, especially tunnels, which were the most spectacular of all. So they wanted to keep a lid on that if possible. So that explains a lot on why I probably surprisingly, a lot of people would find why didn't Kennedy do more? And in fact, I think you read the book and half of you may say, boy, I can understand all this, the fear and the threats, but Kennedy should have done more. He should have helped escapees more than the U.S. did. He should have allowed the coverage. It was not only media suppression, but this is a story that should have been told. So I think the book does not present a black and white view of that. So I certainly would be curious what people think about it when they read the book. So I'm going to set the scene just to read just for 5 minutes from the book. Again, the scene is August 6th, 1962. The Secretary of State has summoned the CBS news manager, Blair Clark, to his office just before midnight, believe it or not, in August. I don't know if you've ever been in Washington, D.C. in August, but you don't really want to be in an air-conditioned office, non-air-conditioned office. But so he called Blair Clark in. Now, Blair Clark is an interesting guy. He went to Harvard. He was actually in the same house as John F. Kennedy at Harvard. They remained close friends. He even went with Kennedy on one of his famous trips to Las Vegas, where he partied with Sinatra and Dean Martin and so forth. So he was really that kind of friend. So he was someone that, as Daniel Schorr believed, Kennedy basically leaned on him, said, get this canceled. So he got called to Dean Rusk's office late that night. There were 3 CIA men there, and Rusk said, "You have to cancel this show." So I will read what happened next that very night, if I may. When Schorr got a call at dawn in his Berlin hotel room, of course they're 5 or 6 hours behind over there, he was perplexed. he was being summoned to the U.S. mission. On arrival, greeted by a U.S. Marine Guard, he was even more startled to learn that he would be speaking on a secure phone line, indicating some sort of top-secret issue arranged by the U.S. military. It wasn't so surprising that the man on the other end was his boss, Blair Clark, but what was he doing in Dean Rusk's office around midnight in Washington? "What's this I hear about you planning to film a Berlin tunnel escape?" Clark asked. "I told our foreign editor all about it," Schorr replied. "Well, I am sitting here with the Secretary of State in his office," Clark said. "Yes," Schorr answered, "and he has convinced me that you shouldn't go ahead and do that." "Why not?" "Because it would be considered a provocation. It could lead to a great deal of trouble, and the State Department doesn't want any unnecessary trouble at the wall." "Well, that's the trouble with the State Department," Schorr replied. "That's why there is a wall." "Dan, I know you don't like to be ordered around," Clark said, putting it mildly, if you know Dan Schorr's reputation. "But that's it. I want you to scrap all your plans to do that film." Schorr was stunned. "Okay," he said, "but would it make any difference for you to know that once this gets around and we don't do it, the tunnelers will go to NBC or, God forbid, ABC? It's an order." The call lasted just 6 minutes. Schorr returned to his hotel humiliated and fuming. The whole concept was wrong. This administration, any administration, dictating news coverage. He knew Blair Clark was a Kennedy man, and he figured that JFK had talked to him, possibly even pressured him, which made Dan even angrier. But there was nothing he could do about it now. Neither Schorr nor the White House knew that another American news team would soon be filming a tunnel escape. Dean Rusk finally got a chance to go home past midnight, but not before dictating a cable marked Eyes Only that was sent to his man Hulick at the Berlin mission shortly after 1 a.m. in the morning. And this is what it said. "I saw Clark tonight, and he agreed to scrub CBS participation in tunnel project. However, there is evidence that this matter has been the subject of communication between Schorr and his home office over a period of time. I am disturbed that so many people were aware of the project. I cannot assess the matter fully here and must leave to local discretion. You should also consider quiet surveillance of the area to ensure that photographers and others were not poised at the tunnel exit that day," even though Schorr was called off. A copy of this cable would be sent to McGeorge Bundy, one of JFK's top aides, and to Pierre Salinger, his press secretary, who would brief the president on its contents. As usual, no reply from the White House signaled approval. And so that was it. That's what Dan Schorr later called the CBS Tunnel that wasn't. In the coming days, just to make sure he got the message, the Berlin embassy and the Bonn embassy and the Berlin mission both called Schorr in and yelled at him for even doing this, and actually we're kind of surprised he wasn't more contrite, but, as they said. Okay, so as I mentioned, the NBC tunnel was still going at this point, and indeed 1 month later, the State Department called in the NBC news president and warned him against covering the tunnel. The State Department didn't know, but they were already 300 or 400 feet into it, and NBC didn't tell them. And so when the tunnel broke through on September 14th, 1962, and brought 29 people from the east to the west in 2 days, it was a shock to the U.S. And it was even bigger shock 3 weeks later when NBC announced they were planning a 90-minute primetime special on the escape, on the tunneling and the escape. So, my book, I've talked a lot about the State Department, White House, and so forth, but a good deal of the book is about the actual tunneling, the people behind it, the problems they had, and the heart-stopping night of the tunnel escape, which again, it's hard to believe hard to believe we got this information, but most of the key participants were still alive and talking about it. So, however, we then jump ahead to in October of 1962, we had the same scenario we saw with Daniel Schorr, where the State Department, with the approval of the White House, tried to bully NBC into halting its film. And so they did. So again, because of the documents we have, we can trace day by day the calling in, once again, NBC executives and the producer, Reuben Frank, who later went on to be president of NBC News, called into Dean Rusk's office, and same deal, we really think you should cancel this. We're not going to tell you, we're not going to, order it, but we really think you need to cancel this project. So same scenario played out. And the correspondent, Pierce Anderton, was very upset about this. I obtained letters he sent home to his wife from her, who's still living in Sweden. So we got letters he sent during this period. And after 3 weeks of this, NBC indeed postponed the show before it was aired. And, people thought it was killed. They said they were just postponing it, but they said they were killing it. Most people thought they were killing it. In fact, the producer, Reuben Frank, wrote out his resignation to quit NBC, whose news, he's the guy who wrote the one of the most famous news lines in history, and helped create the Huntley-Brinkley report. That line at the end where it was "Good night, Chet," and "Good night, David." It seems simple, but it's a famous line in TV history. Reuben Frank was familiar with, was responsible for. So he wrote out his resignation, and a few weeks passed, and the NBC, after more thought, and I've got more exchanges back and forth with the State Department, decided in December to kind of slip the program on the air without a lot of fanfare. And lo and behold, surprisingly, it gained wide ratings against I Love Lucy and Andy Griffith and Danny Thomas, and went on a few months later to win 3 Emmy Awards, including becoming the only documentary to ever win the top Emmy for Program of the Year. And short time after that, lo and behold, the State Department, through the USIA, distributed hundreds of copies of it abroad as a kind of propaganda film for the U.S. They suddenly realized that actually it painted the communist East in a bad light, and actually, when you think about it, actually it's a good thing for us to exploit. So they went from trying to kill these films to exploiting them. So that sort of closes the saga of the tunnels and the CBS in my book. I then have a lengthy epilogue which brings the escape attempts, other tunnels, to the fall of the wall in 1989, and then to the present day. So the epilogue includes a lot of really terrific material. There's also, again, you can ask about it if you want, but there's an incredible storyline in the book about a young Stasi informer who was responsible for infiltrating the leading escape group in West Berlin, leading to the shooting deaths of 2 men, 2 diggers, and the arrest of hundreds of people from this one guy who's just an incredible character. And I managed to get his file from the Stasi archives, or maybe a back channel. I don't want to say which, but anyway, I've got his file for that period, and I think it's probably the most up-close look at the Stasi you'll ever see, because it's, again, week-to-week, day-to-day meetings with this informer. Another storyline is MGM was filming that same year, while all this was going down on underground, was filming a movie about the tunnels above ground. So you had this kind of absurd contrast between literally Hollywood people on the street above, and they even built a fake wall and a fake tunnel. And meanwhile, the real tunnels were going on underneath. And then there's a link at the end which really kind of amazingly ties all this together with the suppression of the NBC film, the Stasi informers. It all comes together, to my surprise, near the climax of the book. So that's an interesting added sidelight. I'm going to show probably about the first 3 minutes of the NBC film. Now, you can find it online at the NBC site. You have to search for it. It's not like it's on their front page, but it's 78 minutes long, and they've deleted the commercials, so it's actually easy to watch. But I think we're going to try to watch about the first 3 minutes here to give you a little flavor of it.
That is number 7, Schornholzer Strasse, a narrow tenement, one city block inside communist East Berlin. On Friday, September 14th, 1962, 26 people walked by twos and threes down this street and through this door. Some had come 200 miles. All were strangers to this place. They came here past the barriers of the Forbidden Zone and past the armed people's policemen on patrol and on post. Across the vacant lot, they could see the Berlin Wall. They went quietly down the cellar stairs, by ladder down a shaft, and stood 15 feet below the surface of Schornholzer Strasse. There was a tunnel there, less than 3 feet wide and 3 feet high. Through this they crawled, 21 adults and 5 children, 140 yards to West Berlin and a free future. Some of the children had to be carried. I am Pierce Anderton, NBC News, Berlin, and this is the story of those people and that tunnel.
It goes on from there. I guess it's still playing here, but that's okay. A couple interesting things there. Pierce Anderton, even though the film eventually aired, he was so upset about that and a few other things that the Emmy that he got for Best Foreign Coverage for this film, his widow told me he always kept in the bathroom of their home. And in fact, when they later moved to England, he tossed it in the trash. He was so disgusted by the treatment, if you can imagine that. Another interesting thing, and it's actually the way I close the main part of my book, is I guess it's spoiler alert. I'll give you that little segment you saw when they did a little close-up of the seven Schornholzer Strasse that they showed in this. Now that tenement's still there. It's been renovated a few years ago to a luxury apartment building, of course. I've visited there naturally. And the kind of my key tunneler, who was the biggest help for me in the book, was part of that escape, was walking by one day when it was being renovated, and that he noted that they were surely going to soon be tossing that number 7 in the trash. And so he came back that night, the age of 70, and climbed up the scaffolding and removed the number 7 from the building, and took it home, and it is attached today to a door in his apartment in West Berlin. So that 7 still, I have photos of it and so forth. So that 7 still exists. So it's kind of symbolic, I guess, of the whole story. So that's pretty much what I have to say based on my talk. So thank you for listening. And as we said, we'll take any questions, preferably at the microphones on either side. and then I guess we'll sign books. So go to the microphones on either side and fire away. Thank you.
When you think about the wall, you usually think about the part around Checkpoint Charlie where it's right in the middle of the urban area. But in the map, you show it goes all the way around the suburbs.
Yeah.
What was on the other side of the suburbs in East Berlin? Was it rural? Was it all suburbs?
Yeah, well, it was, as I said, Berlin was floating in the middle of East Germany, so it was surrounded. So the wall most famously, and in its what the concrete, high concrete form that we know of, was pretty much that dividing line down the middle of the sectors there, where most people lived and was the real border. However, they also had to build the wall around the entire outside of West Berlin, mainly rural areas and so forth. But it was mainly fencing, triple layers of fencing and barbed wire and so forth. So you have to imagine this entire western sector surrounded by some sort of barrier. But Berlin at that time didn't have a great like gigantic suburbs or anything like that. So.
Did NBC wait till the wall was, the tunnel was no longer in use before they did it, or did they just go in and people started to East Berlin catch the tunnel, and then they ran the article?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Okay,
did NBC?
Did NBC wait till the tunnel had all of its usefulness, and they got all the people out they were going to get out?
Yeah.
Then they ran the article, or did they do it while the tunnel was in use?
Yeah, they filmed. The tunnel was already underway when NBC came in. It was about a month of digging had already happened. So they had, I don't know how many feet of tunnel already dug. NBC came in, bought the rights, and started filming at the end of June of 1962. So it was already underway. And then they continued to film off and on, not every day, certainly, for several weeks until the night of the escape. And then the night of the escape, they had been alerted that they had broken through. And, it's just incredible stories about, besides the brave diggers, you had the couriers, who were mainly women, young women, who then had to go into East Berlin and somehow signal to the potential refugees that, the tunnel's ready tonight or tomorrow, and you have to come to this address, or you have to come to this pub near the escape house, and then they would be told, where exactly to go. So these couriers had to find these people, organize them meeting, and then coming to the tunnel at 6 p.m. the night of September 14th. So there's the whole saga of the couriers. So NBC was alerted. They had the film set up looking down into the hole in West Berlin, and they captured every single one of the people coming up the ladder and arriving in the West. So obviously quite emotional scene. So they had this footage going back through all these many months that they were able to put together this incredible documentary. So you can imagine why they were so interested in getting it on the air. But again, ethical questions were raised about paying for the rights, about helping to fund the tunnel. I mean, they'd say, we paid for rights like we pay for rights for Marilyn Monroe's exclusive interviews or whatever. This was a little different because essentially they also helped fund the tunnel itself.
Was the tunnel only used once, and when did the Germans find it?
Yeah, it was used, in fact, again, it's too much to go into, but this tunnel had serious leaks and flooding a couple times over those months. And in fact, they came up short. If you can imagine, they were digging, they had months earlier scouted out the basement of a tenement on Rheinsberger, and so they kind of knew this is what they were heading for. We won't even get into how do you dig how do you dig to the point like this. I'm not expert enough, but a lot of the diggers were engineer students. And they borrowed surveying equipment. I still don't know how you point your way accurately, 20 feet underground. But so they were aiming towards one basement, which they had scouted out, and they had a leak and had to come up one block sooner and not even know where they were going to come up in a basement, anything about the basement, whether people, came down and got their bicycles, 10 times a day, whatever. But they had to because of the leak in the tunnel. So they came up sight unseen in this basement, and fortunately, I guess the basement wasn't in heavy use that day. But because of the leak, the tunnel, they then used the tunnel the next day, brought a few more people in, and then it was impossible to go on. In fact, the 29 people kind of had to splash through, crawl through, several inches of water much of the way. I should point out that there were 6 or 7 children, right down to babies who came through. So they had to abandon the tunnel after that. So it got 29 out in 2 days, essentially.
Can you give an overview of what happened to most of these people? I know it'd be too hard to go into the 200 plus.
The escapees or the tunnelers?
Yeah.
Well, the tunnelers, like I said, I reached and interviewed them. So that was, I can tell you great detail what happened to them. Escapees were harder to find, but I did talk to some of them. In fact, one of the fellow I talked to you earlier about, who climbed up and got the number 7, he later married the first woman who came through the tunnel, a young woman, and she's still living. I interviewed her at great length, so she's got the whole inside story on the escape side. And there were others, there are some others too, but she's one of the prime people. And the most important courier was still alive, and I tracked her down and interviewed her. So I sort of hit all the different levels there.
A couple of questions. In finding the film, would we Google it?
Pardon?
Would we Google it?
The NBC, to watch the NBC film?
Yeah, to see the film ourselves. Is it streamed to us from?
Yeah, you probably, if you put in NBC film Berlin Tunnel 1962,
and
the name of the film is The Tunnel.
Okay.
If you go to the NBC site, and search, you'll probably find it.
Okay, that's great. And then I have another question.
Okay.
In researching this myself and studying this, later on I heard that the East German police demolished a lot of the buildings that were close to the wall itself. So why wasn't this number 7 demolished also like the others? Well,
you could see in that little clip, buildings in front of it, because it's not right on the wall. Again, this is 2 blocks from the death strip. So the buildings that were demolished, and the only reason they could film the scenes of that building is because they had demolished the block closer to the wall.
Right.
So they were able to actually shoot through there. But they did, the East Germans did demolish as many buildings as they could. The first, probably sometime in your life, you've seen dramatic newsreel footage of, in those early weeks after the wall went up, people jumping out of windows. At Bernauer Strasse, which had all these large apartment buildings, basically the outside of the walls was the border of East Germany, or East Berlin, and the sidewalk was West Berlin. So people could jump out their windows, and if they landed safely on the sidewalk, they were in West Berlin. So those buildings, and of course people died jumping out the windows. The West Berlin Fire Department would sometimes be signaled, and they would arrive with their big nets. People would jump into the nets. And many people escaped that way. Many others also died. But the point is that the East Germans then frantically started boarding up, or bricking up those windows, and then kicking people out, and then in many cases tearing down the buildings, or they just left them empty. But those windows were bricked up after a few weeks. So, okay, other questions here? Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for being such a great audience, and for listening, and for some of you, maybe skipping the first inning of the World Series by the time you get home. So I can't give you.